Hey everyone, my name is Matt Haynes, and I am delighted to introduce you all to PJ Oakland. And PJ Oakland has been a narration teacher for me and goes by the brand name Dr. Dialect. And this is, I could either resist Sergeant Obvious or I could march to his beat and include PJ in my series about accents. So, PJ, please introduce yourself. Tell the folks a little bit about you.
Hey Matt, thanks for having me. Tell them a little about me. Actor for coming up on 40 years, and accents and character work have been part of that, I think, since the day I got started as a kid. Yeah, lots of film, TV stuff, theater stuff, and then audiobooks has been my bread and butter from the narration, the coaching, and also the producing standpoint, wearing all three of those hats for over a decade now.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so, what do you remember a context or a feeling you had when you were young that sort of made you that you think could be like the prologue to your bio about you becoming Dr. Dialect?
Hmm. I know that the legend goes, and I kind of have some vague memory of this, that I was 4 years old when I pointed to the TV and said to my mom, I want to do that. So I think that's where it all started.
Uh,
And she did everything in her power to prevent me from doing that for a long time. That's another long story that we don't have time for. But I know that shortly thereafter, definitely in a single digit age, I was doing celebrity impressions, character voices, accents for sure, trying sometimes with success to entertain my family and friends with things like that. Sometimes failing miserably, which I recommend everyone do, and that's useful. That's where you build those skills. You have to try, you have to play. I'm always encouraging people just goof around, go big, practice broadly, and that's where you find the not just limitations, but you actually extend the limitations. You push the envelope of what you're capable of. So you try stuff out. Some of it works, some of it doesn't, but you need that practice. You need that sense of play and fun and experimentation, I think, to bring it into fruition.
This, going along those lines, what were do you think some of your failures that stand out the most to you? Maybe not even just with accents, but just in terms of voiceover, times when you think you went too big or didn't go big enough?
I don't know, and I have like specific examples of that, but I can say that, I mean, you look at an acting career and, where I started out, the failures, and I don't really look at them as failures per se. I just mean that some things entertain your audience and some don't. But if you consider that thousands and thousands and thousands of auditions over the decades that you didn't book, right? And if your goal was to book all those jobs, but that's not what it's about, And I don't know, maybe I go into some of that with my coaching and whatnot, but as cliche as it is, the embrace of the journey is everything. You have to find joy in creating and bringing things into the world for other people's enjoyment, entertaining, just creating, as I've often said, especially recently. Be a creator, not a destroyer.
Mm-hmm.
uh, Inform everything you do with love, and just bring good things into the world, and good things will come out of that. Not all of it resonates with everyone. You won't book every job that you audition for, but again, I wouldn't frame those as failures so much. They're just learning experiences, and they're mile markers on that journey. And if you really do embrace it as a journey, and you enjoy the process, and you enjoy what you're putting out there, like if you can believe in your work and continue to care about developing your work and evolving your work, that it's a craft, that there's no finish line, you're never done learning, I think you can kind of spin almost anything positive.
With each leg of this journey that you take, particularly when faced with an accent that you may not have done before, and perhaps I need to call upon a younger you to answer this question because I imagine there's a ton. It might be sometimes hard to find accents that you presently aren't familiar with, but what is the first step, or first couple of steps that you take when you've got an accent? It's maybe from character that has a role in maybe 10 to 20% of the book,
Sure.
and you're faced with really working with this. What do you do?
Some of the things are, this again comes up in my coaching all the time in terms of tips. I mean, I even do a course I call How to Be Your Own Dialect Coach, which largely focuses on these types of things, general ideas of what you can do. And I think of that as a teach you how to fish rather than give you the fish kind of workshop. I've done that for lots of people, but especially narrators, because we're often faced with these types of challenges where you have a book and there might be 5 or 6 different accents you need to portray. In no way is it practical to do an hour-long session for each of those accents with a dialect coach in the 1 week lead up to when you're going to record the book. There's nothing practical about that. Number one, it's not cost effective, but number two, how are you really going to get a lot out of that, right? You don't even have the time to practice each one individually and absorb them and work on them. So there's a few things I talk about in relation to that. One is, first of all, understand what the actual goal is. If you're a solo narrator on a book, the listener is in on the conceit. They know you're the one narrator. They're buying into that. It's part of the suspension of disbelief. And therefore, if you're doing accented characters in dialogue, like you say, might be 10% of a book, a supporting role, what have you, those accents don't have to be perfect by
Mhm.
any stretch of the imagination. And I'm often the first one saying, even though I specialize in accent and character work, the who trumps the what. Who these characters are is always, without exception, more important than what they sound like, right? So a little flavor goes a long way. So if you can tap into a few key things that indicate, represent, give the flavor, cross the threshold of who is speaking for the listener, but then just give a little flavor about, oh, right, that's the German one, and there's the Romanian guy, or what have you. A little flavor will go a long way. Now, to get to the other part of your question in terms of what it is you actually look for if you're doing this on your own, or what I'm coaching others to do, or even do myself if I find myself in that situation, is I break things down in my coaching into sort of two buckets. There's the placement bucket and the phonetics bucket, the sound changes. And in the spirit of a little goes a long way, you don't have to find too many things in that sound change bucket. You might notice something specific that stands out, right? Where you don't want to get yourself in trouble is when you land on something sort of light and generic that could be several different things that might work for that one accent that's required, but it might not work when you have 4 different accents that have certain similarities, and your light version of the one could be a bunch of different things. For example, I start to give you a little something I make up on the spot. I've done this before, but let's try it out for you and your program. I'm doing something like this. We make it up. I put in a few different aspects, and we could say, well, this is for the character in the book. It could be the Italian character. It could be the Romanian character. Maybe he's a Russian guy. Maybe it's a Greek character. And I don't think anything about what I just did would be offensive to any listener out there if
Mhm.
it was any one of those 4 things. Like, yeah,
Mm.
I buy that. The
Yeah. Yeah.
challenge then comes when you get to the higher levels of it is, what if you're doing that international spy thriller and there's the scene where the Greek, the Italian, the Romanian, and the Russian are
Russian.
speaking
Yeah.
to each other? Now's where latching on to those very specific things. Like if I was doing Russian accent, for example, and I say like happy, happy, and I hear that velar fricative H sound on here, the slide, that yod between the H and the short E sound that I've replaced the short A with. Okay, suddenly now it's more unmistakably Russian, and I'm not going to confuse that with an Italian, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So
Yes.
just give a quick example essentially of like, I'm looking for those specific distinguishing characteristics,
Uh-huh.
right? Placement, to go to that bucket for a quick moment, that's a bit of an esoteric concept, but I try to simplify it for people. For today's purposes, I would just say that understand it's where you send sound and how you shape it, not about where you create sound. So the shape of your mouth, where you're feeling the vibration and the resonance, since essentially where you're sending that sound, those are the key components of placement. And I sometimes lump in there like melody, the music, that all becomes part of it as you get the sound changes. So you put that together and you have an approximation of something that an audience member will buy as what you're looking to portray, right? So that's sort of the key of it. And then if you find those specifics like all right, I'm hearing that velar fricative H or that yod sound, that slide between consonant and vowel for the Russian, maybe a couple of vowel shifts. You might only need three, five, seven of those things, and it's more than enough. The
Hmm.
next obvious question is, where do you find them? And then that for me comes down to, if you're on your own, you're just working as an actor, not with a dialect coach, you might default to something like YouTube, for example. But a common mistake I think people make is they'll put in, such and such accent. And then you might get some kids doing like Tumblr accent challenges, or dialect coaches looking to sell things, or who knows what you'll get. And I say just hack it. Hack it by being, outthink it in your search and do something like, Finnish foreign minister. Now I'm likely to get a local politician from Finland, and because he's the foreign minister, he's speaking in English around the world,
Hmm.
as the international language of diplomacy, if you will. So I can likely find an interview with a Finnish foreign minister that's going to give me a really authentic Finnish accented English on
Hmm.
YouTube that
Hmm.
I can study for a few minutes and say, oh, okay, here's what's happening there, and here's what's happening there.
Yeah.
So that's a good hack, things like that. That's a good trick. And then there's good dialect sites out there. Paul Meyer's Dialects Archive, brilliant service to the world that he put together, phenomenal stuff. There's the George Mason University site, which is the Speech Accent Archive. A lot of these things will give you samples from everywhere, recorded samples, usually working with prepared scripts. So you know what to listen for, sometimes with interview portions, so you get a more candid version. And in some cases, the websites are even breaking down what's happening. So you can look at those notes and it helps you figure out what to do. There you go. That's my super abridged version of a huge sort of answer.
Yeah, but still, my goodness, what a wonderful tool set that you just gave us, to start. I want to before I ask my last question, I want to just make sure that viewers, first of all, recognize that I benefited tremendously from PJ's coaching, and I even used techniques that he taught me this last summer for an audition that I did this morning. So.
Amazing.
It works. It's applicable. It is effective.
That's awesome.
So, PJ, how can people? And I'll put this information in the video description as well. But just what do you offer folks who wanna get your services?
I do private coaching, and as I often talk about, I coach all aspects of the industry, especially when it comes to audiobooks. So that means everything that I consider to be in the business bucket and everything in the craft bucket: performance coaching, dialect coaching, character work. And on the business side, putting yourself out there, especially now that I've spent so many years as a producer in that world, knowing what people like me who are on the casting side of things, wearing that hat, are looking for, so you can kind of set up your website accordingly, know how to market yourself to the decision makers out there who can cast you. So I coach all aspects of the industry on both sides, business and craft, privately. And then in terms of the group coaching stuff, I'm a co-founder with Deborah Dion of the Dion Institute. We have the really, really popular, lovely, I mean, it's just such a beautiful environment, our masterclass series, that I host and coach with always a special guest who's a casting director, producer, director from the audiobook world. Those
Mhm.
are just amazing. Everybody loves them. Everybody gets stuff out of them. It's a warm, supportive, creative environment. So those are great. We do group introductory intensive courses for people sort of just getting into it. And then in addition to that, I do, under the aegis of Dr. Dialect that you mentioned, I do my character voice toolbox and the how to be your own dialect coach courses, other stuff that's out there online. I'm really easy to find. So the Dion Institute, Deyan Institute, that's
Mhm.
where you find the masterclass and the stuff that we do there. And then my own website, drdialect.com, drdialect.com. And my email is there for everyone, and
Okay,
stuff comes to me
fantastic.
personally. I'm very easy to reach.
Great, great. Okay, so uh, final question, which is you talked earlier about the Russian, the Italian, the Romanian, right? And how if you get them together, you want to shade each one or give one, its own little bit of color to distinguish from the others. Now, I find that this also applies with people who are local to a certain area and their skin begins to crawl when somebody says, "Oh, yes, you're from blah, blah, blah." And then they start whipping out a bit of an impersonation and
Right.
like, that's such and such region that's not here. So an example, a personal example is I grew up in Bar Harbor, Maine. So a lot of
Hmm.
people like be like, "Aha, Bahaba." And I was like, no, no.
Nice.
And then even though I understand what they're talking about and that
Yeah.
sort of thing, it's like, no, 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 no. We're not Boston, we're not New Hampshire, we're not transatlantic.
Yeah.
There is an R there. It's just way back in the wisdom teeth. Bar Harbor.
Right.
That's how it is. Do you, in areas where you've spent a lot of time or where you grew up,
Yeah.
is there oh yes, it's a blah, but a quick hack is maybe adjust it to a blah.
That's such a specific question, Matt. But I do have an answer for you. I
Okay.
grew up as a working class New York boy on Long Island. And so this comes up a lot when people want to do a New York accent. And it's one of my favorite to teach because it's like so in my DNA and it's always at the ready. The AR diphthong, essentially the way we would pronounce the letter R as if it were a word, right? AR, that diphthong, R. That sound, it's amazing how often people miss that when they're doing New York. And they so very frequently want to break toward what you were just talking about, which is that New England, mostly Massachusetts sound of the ah, right?
Mhm.
So that's a huge one. And I'll even pair it, I'll give you a second one. And that is the short O in New York. All right. I can't get too complicated here, but just very briefly, you've got the short O as it relates to standard American and a word like not, N-O-T, and cop, as in, my brother's not a cop. He's not a cop. That's New York, right? He's not a cop. That's the
Mhm.
short O that merges with the concept of short O in standard American. But then
Mhm.
you have a separate set of words that would be short O in standard American that now become the or diphthong
Mhm. Mhm.
in New York. And then people blur the lines between what is or and what is ah. So if you say, if you're doing a New York accent, and I say, my brother's not a cop, you now have a problem. But if I say I'm going to walk the dog, then you're correct. He's
Mhm.
not a
Mhm.
cop. I'm going to walk the dog. And you need to know which is which, right?
Yep.
So that's a big
Yep.
one. And back to the AR, people want to say, I'm going to, yeah, I'm from New York. I'm going to park the car. No, you're not. You're going to park the car. All right.
Uh-huh.
You got to
Uh-huh.
park the car. It's vertical. It's a car. It's not a car. So you're off by a few states if you do things like that. So those are fun, but I think it's very funny you came up with such a specific question. We're like, I guess if I think about it, yeah, that does come up. So yeah, when you know an accent intimately, like in your case, and Maine has a lot of subtlety. I mean, you got your Downeasters and you've got your Pepperidge Farm remembers, and you got so many versions of Maine, which is very funny. You even have you ever experienced Acadian?
As in Acadia National Park?
As in the Acadian French that's associated with it.
No.
Dude, that's in your home state. And that's another one that is just off the wall. Hardly ever comes up, but one of these incredibly unique. That's where Cajun comes from, a Cajun. So,
No kidding.
yep. So, Cajun French down in Louisiana, Acadian French in northwestern Maine. These are like, that's another crazy Mainer dialect that hardly ever comes up. It's very isolated, but it's essentially this French Canadian influence in Maine. It's wild. Crazy stuff.
Well, thank you so much, PJ. Folks, this is PJ Oakland. I'm Matt Haynes. I hope that our voices in your ears meet again real soon.